something beside me, a light to the kerosene, and the places aren't real anymore, and the faces don't say anything, in the silent light of the mind-blown sphere. It's a game, Devil's Chess Club. Devil's Chess Club.
Welcome to Devil's Chess Club. I'm Aaron Good. This episode of Devil's Chess Club is available to everyone courtesy of Four Died Trying, the new documentary film series which explores the extraordinary lives and cataclysmic assassinations of JFK, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and RFK. A Patreon page for Four Died Trying has launched. It offers patrons the earliest access to new films and a number of other perks, now including access to the newest film, Chapter 1, The World as It Was. It's now available at the Four Die Trying Patreon page, so check it out there. Soon you will also be able to purchase Chapter 1 on Apple TV and other streaming services. Please support us by subscribing to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. You'll get access to many episodes of the American Exception podcast, including the Peter Dale Scott Oral History series, with new episodes coming this month. Peter is an international treasure. We've begun discussing his lesser-known but very important poem and article about the forgotten Russian 9/11, as well as its connections to the American 9/11 and to so much more. This is fascinating material coming from a true iconoclast. I urge everyone to listen to these by subscribing to the AE podcast on Patreon. That's American Exception. Today, my co-hosts Bryce Green and David Talbot join me to discuss a number of politically and historically important items. But first, I have an announcement. As of March 1st, I no longer work for the Kennedy Beacon, the publishing outlet for the RFK Super PAC. Since I started writing for them and co-hosting their podcast, I supported RFK Jr.'s candidacy because he has far better positions than the other candidates on a number of important issues. Basically, I'll just go over some of them now. Why it would be worth having him in there, or why I thought that at the time, that it would be worth campaigning for him. He supports ending the U.S. empire's sanctions regimes, the coups by the CIA, the bombings, the wars. He supports closing down the empire of bases around the world that we can no longer really afford. He wants to launch an American Truth and Reconciliation process to deal with issues like the political assassinations of the 1960s, which include his father and uncle, of course. He wants to deal with the rentier housing crisis, the way that these huge firms have bought up housing and want to make everybody into debt peons, basically, and renters. He wants to establish a binding international bioweapons ban, so a ban on the kind of research that seems to have given rise to COVID. He supports medical freedom. He supports taking control of our regulatory system and fighting corruption and regulatory capture. He wants to protect cash money as a currency in the United States. He opposes surveillance and censorship, and he wants to pardon Assange and Snowden on his first day in office. I think those are admirable things. However, I had hopes that Bobby would use the power of the presidency to avert catastrophe, and I don't think that this is viable anymore. I thought Bobby was a figure who might successfully leverage his family name and outrage over the pandemic and shock at many horrendous establishment crimes like the 9/11 wars, the Arab Spring wars, the Ukraine catastrophe, the Russiagate hoax, the Epstein suicide farce, the current generally terrible state of the U.S.-led West, or the white world, or whatever we want to call it. Now, there are many things I would disagree with Bobby Kennedy, RFK Jr.'s campaign, particularly his kind of nods to libertarianism and occasionally couching things in belligerent or confrontational ways about China, even though on the whole he is more sensible towards China and avoiding a new Cold War than the other candidates. But these were things I could accept if it meant reorienting the United States empire away from a doomed quest for global dominance, for unipolar empire. So if a coalition dedicated to opposing the U.S. empire could emerge around a president of the United States, we could at least diffuse the prospect of doomsday. I'm pretty sure that RFK does not believe what he says about Israel, though I'm not at liberty to substantiate that. Because of this, I held out hope that he would modify his position, that he would break with the Israel lobby, because Zionism was and is a bloody albatross around his neck. Why would he so degrade himself by taking such a politically disastrous position for a relatively radical reformer? At the heart of all this is that it is absurd to package oneself as the peace candidate while backing Zionism to the hilt. There is no soft peddling the depravity of this. It is immoral and unacceptable, on top of being an insult to the legacy of his slain father and uncle. That said, there are some complicating factors here. For one thing, there are indeed many lessons to take from the Kennedy assassinations. We don't live in a democracy. The oligarchy has a veto power over politics, up to and including assassination of any official, including the president. A leader that cannot overcome or accommodate these forces will fail. Zionism seems to be unassailable in the U.S. oligarchy or establishment or deep state, whatever we want to call it. Zionism, fueled by this messianic Greater Israel crusader mentality, that's the driving force of neoconservatism, which since Reagan's election has been the dominant current in the U.S. foreign policy establishment, the imperial hive mind. Would RFK Jr.'s political destruction or assassination be guaranteed if he came out against Israel and thereby became the focal point for American and global outrage at Israel's crimes? Recall that his father, RFK Sr., was assassinated by the regime, by the deep state, using a Palestinian patsy, no less. I held out hope that RFK Jr. would do something politically wise. He was pretty early on endorsed, or quasi-endorsed, by Professor Jeffrey Sachs. Sachs is extremely knowledgeable about global politics. He was in and out of Israel over the past several decades, and he saw the insane Greater Israel blood and soil madness take over that country, with all the colonial settlers working to establish facts on the ground, aka slow motion ethnic cleansing tantamount to genocide. Now the genocide is no longer in slow motion. Sachs has called for the sensible policy that Bobby should adopt. He's called for using the United Nations Security Council to recognize a Palestinian state within pre-1967 borders. I would elaborate on this and suggest that the UN should create a mechanism similar to what Dag Hammarskjöld and JFK were planning with West Papua. JFK wanted West Papua, with its ethnically Micronesian population, to be independent from the Dutch and from Indonesia, but there was no coherent or easy way to hand over power to a West Papuan administration. Therefore, a UN organization was conceived which could handle administrative duties until the country could govern itself. None of this came to pass. Both Dag Hammarskjöld and JFK would be assassinated. The vast, unimaginable riches of West Papua fell into American hands, Rockefeller hands, basically. Standard Oil got the petroleum or its little offshoots, and Freeport Sulfur secured the biggest gold mine in the history of the world. Lots of motive for murder just regarding Indonesia and West Papua policy, but I digress. The Jeff Sachs Israel-Palestine plan could be done if the U.S. had a president committed to it. We see how the U.S. uses the UN Security Council to prevent any non-genocidal final solution for the Palestinian crisis. When leftists say elections don't matter, they are whistling in the graveyard, more or less. If anti-imperialist forces cannot attain control of the state, the left has no decisive impact on U.S. foreign policy. The left can't even influence the empire's insane policies enough to prevent the empire from acting so aggressively imperialistic that it destroys its own empire. The empire may even destroy human civilization. I do understand that a two-state plan is not really justice. I don't see how the first Nakba in 1948 can possibly be justified, much less everything that has followed. But RFK Jr. could have presented a plan that would have secured homelands for the people of Palestine and for the Jewish people who have settled there. This could be the cornerstone of the post-US empire world, a multipolar system where international politics are governed by international law with state sovereignty as its foundation. This could be a great turning point for the whole world, and it could save Palestinians and even the Zionists, who maybe don't deserve to be saved. But let's be real, the Zionists are just a microcosm of Western imperialism or global whiteness or whatever we want to call it. Western civilization is built upon staggering acts of imperialism, institutionalized expropriation, exploitation, and even elimination of other nations. Given that this is no longer tenable, why not have Americans, Zionists, and the rest of the Western imperial gang give up the ghost and start solving some of these problems? These problems are easily solved once it is recognized that not solving them, or solving them with genocide, is no longer an option if we wish to avoid greater calamity. All that said, I had to walk away from RFK Jr. He may want to do great and important things as president. Being myself someone on the political left, I know how vain and foolish it is to never compromise, but I cannot be a party to getting a guy in the White House on the backs of thousands of massacred children who are already living in a hellish concentration camp. I tried to move heaven and earth to make it so that there would be one anti-empire candidate who would also deal with the Zionism issue that is inextricably intertwined with our imperial misadventures. Unsurprisingly, I did not succeed. This is disappointing, but let's be real, the empire is losing. It is just disappointing that we anti-imperialists in the US are not really an important part of this. Maybe that is fitting. Aaron Bushnell seems to be the only white American to grasp and embody the moral gravity of this moment. Not that I wish for others to emulate him. I've personally suffered no small amount of stress and humiliation over RFK Jr.'s ridiculous Zionism. But thinking of Aaron Bushnell or people in Gaza, I can't complain too much. Besides, I do have thick skin. I went into a political science doctoral program and wrote a dissertation about the shocking criminality and mendacity of the US regime, a dissertation that I knew would basically disqualify me from getting tenure. Whether or not that is cool or very unwise, I don't know of anyone else in the discipline who did that. So when anonymous internet trolls have said, things like, haha, you killed your brand over RFK, I have to shake my head. I think that I have established that I do not think first and foremost in terms of building a brand. Are we so far gone that even leftists can't help but reflexively think in terms of branding and public relations? I personally think Bill Hicks was right about people who think this way and what they should do. Maybe not. As a scholar, I've tried to create social science theory which can inform a new, deep historiography of the U.S. empire and its insane political economy. Much of this work is in my dissertation published as American Exception, Empire, and the Deep State. A documentary film version is coming out soon. If one of my critics thinks they can pick apart my scholarship, I invite them to try. If any one of them would like to write a review of my book, which attempts to rebut its main theses or to find fault with a methodology or whatever, I'd encourage them to go for it. Just sit down at the computer, start typing until you have finished a review, then put your name on it and publish or post it somewhere. That would be how one could present a scholarly critique of an academic text. I'd welcome the chance to respond to any serious critique of my main theses, which I'd say have only been affirmed in the intervening years since I wrote it. For what it's worth, I'm planning a sequel as well, one that begins where American Exception left off, at the dawn of the so-called Reagan Revolution. For now, I have to say goodbye to the Kennedy Beacon crew. I know that many people in the U.S. and elsewhere are really unhappy and kind of despise Bobby Kennedy and his supporters over this Zionism business. But the people I worked with at the Kennedy Beacon were good, sincere people. I'll miss working with Charlie Lyons, Calla Kelly, Francis Scott, Nico House, and Livio Sanchez. Some were Kennedy-style left liberals, some were more on the medical freedom side, But none of those people I mentioned were there because of their support for Zionism or for the genocide in Gaza. They were sincere people motivated to do something to confront the multiple growing crises that this country and that the world are facing here at the twilight of Western imperialism. This is a heartbreaking situation. Are we all dupes of the Israel lobby? That would seem to describe anyone who votes for any of the three 2024 contenders. Something like 70% of the US and over 90% of the world wants the Gaza genocide to stop. In the American political system, that translates to 0 anti-genocide candidates out of the 3 serious presidential contenders. What can one do in the face of such sinister and obvious political despotism? I honestly don't know. Aaron Bushnell had a profound answer to that question. Back with Bryce Green and David Talbot once again. David Talbot, how are you?
Yeah, very good. Thank you.
Bryce Green, how was Indiana today?
Well, this morning it's cold. Tomorrow it's going to be hot, and the next day it's going to be cold again. So this is climate change spring in in Bloomington, Indiana.
Yeah, it's weird. The weather is getting a little bit weirder, but at least it's going to warm up eventually. And I'm glad that we have you here as our Indiana spokesman, since I can't really be in that role anymore. We have a lot to talk about, and since I have spoken in the intro about my departure from the Kennedy Beacon, David Talbot is still writing for the Kennedy Beacon, and he has an article on Bobby Kennedy, and he's going to talk about that and talk about why he is staying with the Kennedy Beacon, despite sharing some of my misgivings on important issues here. So, David, tell us about your article, and if you'd rather start with why you're staying with the Kennedy Beacon and still supporting the campaign, you could do that too as a preface.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. Well, as you know, I have major disagreements with Bobby around Israel. I've communicated that to Bobby himself, and we've talked about it at great length. We've talked about it on the show. And I think what's happening in Gaza now is an atrocity. And the world is correct in trying to restrain Israel from killing more people, mostly women and children. I think it's atrocious what is happening. And I can't understand Bobby's analysis, which is so right on, as you know, his anti-imperial analysis and what he says about Ukraine being a proxy war between the West and Russia and so on, why that doesn't extend to Israel as well. So it's very frustrating to me, as you know, but I have decided, unlike you, to stick with the campaign because I want to continue to influence it in the right way. I think if it is a three-way race, as I think it is, between Trump and Biden, or whoever the Democratic establishment decides is a better candidate than Biden and replaces him, and we could talk about that, I think Bobby is head and shoulders still, despite Israel, the best candidate in the race. And I think President Kennedy, too, in starting next year, would be, I think, very, very good for the country and for the world, despite his stand on Israel, despite supporting Israel the way he does. And I heard his most recent interview with Saudi television, and it was very disappointing. It was very frustrating what he had to say about Israel. But his other issues, whether it's a corporate control takeover of Washington, whether it's what's happening at the border, whether it's the environmental catastrophe that we're facing as a planet, Bobby is, I think, saying all the right things. So that's why I say he speaks the truth on most subjects, not on Israel, but on every other subject.
And you know, as much as I really can't even handle listening to him speak about Israel and Palestine, that's kind of been the case for a while. I try to read transcripts if I could, just because it's faster and it's a way to get it over with quicker, like tearing a Band-Aid off quickly. I'll say this. I mean, you in this column, which you'll talk about a little bit more, you talk about how he speaks the truth about these issues, and he does, but for this issue of Palestine and Israel. And I will say, I would also add this. on Israel-Palestine, he does speak the truth unintentionally in that he is telling us that this aspect of the despotism, the top-down power that rules us, the Zionist aspect of the establishment is essentially unassailable. And it doesn't matter what global public opinion is. It doesn't matter what U.S. public opinion is. They are hegemonic in the West in terms of like having an unassailable position in the political orthodoxy. And Bobby, by having these totally absurd positions, I mean, when he talks about the neocons and he speaks lucidly about the neocons' global dominance plan and how they've taken over U.S. foreign policy, and then he says these things about Palestine, it's schizophrenic. But he has to know that. I'm pretty certain he does. And yet he is doing this. It's a very strange position for a politician to be in. I don't recall anything like this. He does ignore or go against establishment orthodoxies, even in ways that people on the left have been slow to recognize. I think the disaster of the COVID lockdowns and everything, and all the COVID measures in general, much of the left, especially the liberal left, is still, many of them are still in a strange place over that. But I think that this Israel issue, it's too, as I've said, it's too much. But these other issues, David, explain the importance of these other issues that he does tell the truth about and how that does separate him from the other candidates.
Yeah, I would like to. But let me also add, Aaron, something you touched on before I go on to that, which is the power of the Israel lobby in America is, I think, a very, very bad influence on U.S. policy. The Israel lobby, as you know, is very powerful in the media, in the news media, as well as in politics. And groups like AIPAC and other groups influence American politics way too much through the power of money, through donations, campaigns. And now they're even targeting Congress people like Bowman in New York, who have the temerity to speak up for a ceasefire, which to me is the only humanitarian position to take on what's happening in Gaza. They're massacring people, defenseless people. And as I posted recently on Facebook, to me, it's akin to what happened in Warsaw during the World War II. And the Jews who rose up against the Nazi occupation of Warsaw and Poland were heroes to me. And they're, of course, the history as well. They're not terrorists, they're heroes. And the same people who fight back, who resist now the occupation in Gaza and West Bank are also heroes because they're facing an implacable foe, the IDF, the Israeli army, and they're using huge bombs and weapons from the U.S. that we, as American taxpayers, pay for. So it's really a moral and political outrage. I understand why you left the campaign in high dudgeon, and I think the Israel lobby has a lot to answer for in this country. I think they were even, the Israel lobby, and this was touched on recently by Jefferson Morley, our friend who runs JFK Facts on Substack, which is, if you're interested in the Kennedy assassinations, you really should read. And he touched on this, writing about James Jesus Angleton, who was the CIA official in charge of counterintelligence for many years during the Cold War. And he was essentially a double agent. He was working for Israel as well as the US. And he made sure that Israel got the atomic bomb, which changed politics forever in the Middle East, as you know. And there was no more bigger target or wish on the Israeli list than getting that technology, the atomic technology. And President Kennedy opposed it. He stood in the way of Israel getting the bomb. He was against nuclear proliferation. He thought it was a great danger for Israel to get the bomb, or any country to get the bomb that didn't have it already. And he opposed it. And as soon as he was removed, his successor, President Johnson, made sure that Israel got the bomb and got all the weapons it wanted. So, and it armed Israel. Ever since then, Israel has been our proxy, our police state. In fact, Israel is the tail that wagged the dog in this country, as we have talked about earlier. It influences what's happened in Washington to a great degree, to I think a very negative degree. So Bobby is aware of this. He's in a who killed his uncle and father. He's looked into this with great, I think, courage, frankly, because the rest of the Kennedy family won't go there, won't go to the dark side, won't understand that dark history. And was Israel involved in the assassinations of his father and his uncle? I don't know. I haven't done the research, but I think we should.
Right. I think that that's the other aspect of what has happened here that we can't speak authoritatively about or definitively about. But besides the lobbying activities, AIPAC and the political contributions, and besides the PR machine, the civil society manipulation with like the ADL, which is essentially a totalitarian kind of an enterprise because its whole job is to punish any group in civil society or in politics or the corporate world, any group that is critical of Zionism, the ADL comes after them and tars them as anti-Semites. So that's another aspect of it, which is not exactly the same as AIPAC, a political action committee, but it's very important. I mean, when you see the Girl Scouts, the Girl Scouts are afraid or bending the knee to the Israel lobby. I mean, it's really something. And then, but the other aspect of it, which you allude to with the Angleton discussion here, is their powerful position in the clandestine realm, which I think has only grown more over time. I think that Watergate was a neocon coup, essentially, and an alliance of Zionist and domestic neocons, right-wing militarists like people like Rumsfeld and Cheney, and that essentially became dominant in U.S. politics. And then with all of the investigations after Watergate, the scandals and whatnot, it didn't get rid of the clandestine criminality of politics. I think it removed it to even further from congressional oversight, like the FOIA Act and other things like that. I think all these things, they really just forced the government to be more secretive and sinister. And one beneficiary of that was Israel, because I think that some sensitive things got outsourced to them because their commitment to American unipolarity was greater than even the Americans' commitment to it. They needed it more than anyone. And so, the Epstein thing is probably the most obvious example where Epstein seems to have pretty clear ties to intelligence and to the Israeli side of intelligence, because that makes sense. It's why they have, to get around spying laws, they have like Britain spy on the Americans sometimes, right? So that they can say, hey, we're not spying, Britain is. And then they can get all the information they want. That sort of thing. This has been the logic of the deep state, and Israel plays a part in it. And it's probably when we're thinking of like, how could they possibly have this much power? We have to understand that a lot of this is below the surface, because that's the way that the U.S. has done this. And a lot of this was set up by very waspy people like Alan Dulles, and William Donovan was a right-wing Catholic. But, the point is, it wasn't mostly Jewish people that created this U.S. clandestine network. But I think that after the fallout of Watergate and such, a lot of it got consolidated in the hands of international, kind of supranational entities, and Israeli intelligence is likely a part of this. And so they're even more powerful than we know. We just know that, look at what we see. We've got 3 candidates, the world and even the U.S. population opposes this policy, and it's the only choice for us. It's horrifying.
Yeah.
Right.
Look, go ahead, Bryce.
Oh, I was just going to say it's interesting to see the differing approaches from you guys about how you feel about your time at the Kennedy Beacon. I didn't work there, but when I did initially hear about RFK's candidacy, I was pretty interested, especially given the fact that he was saying iconoclastic things, and that, of course, his relationship to some of the deep events that we talk about and study here. But I maintain that I would sit largely on the sidelines in presidential politics conversations. His position on Israel concerned me even before October 7th. But afterwards, the fact that he was so enthusiastic about it was, deeply troubling. And, even if he does have those anti-imperialist bona fides, and he is serious about at least his desire to have a soft landing from this rigid empire that we have, it seems that he's ill-equipped to do so if he's not willing to speak out against, some of the most obvious crimes right in front of our eyes. And so I guess that calls into question the efficacy of the entire project, of what he would hope to do or what we would like him to do. And so, again, I guess I was right to sit on the sidelines of presidential politics, because even though if it is a three-man race, and it seems increasingly to be a one-man race. I mean, given the fact that the Biden administration doesn't seem to care if they win or lose, and that Trump is, Trump is Trump and has his popularity, and I haven't seen much of RFK in the news media, and you need coverage if you want to be able to have a fighting chance in these areas. But and so that's why I do think that it's not a foregone conclusion. Of course, a lot can happen between now and November, but if trends persist, and even if there is a ceasefire, which I do assume there'll be before November, if trends persist, it doesn't look like there's anything other than Trump in the future.
Well, let me talk about why I stuck with the campaign, and Aaron, the other issues besides Israel on which Bobby is on the correct side. But let me talk to you both, because you're younger than I am. I'm 72, and I've seen a lot of campaigns. I've been involved with a lot of campaigns. And no, politics, I have to tell you, is not pure. Far from it. It's about getting yourself dirty. And JFK ran for president, someone we revere this day because he's a man of peace, because of the peace speech he delivered, because he came out so heavily against the military-industrial complex, probably got his head blown off in Dallas because he opposed those warlike policies. He would have withdrawn all troops from Vietnam. I talked to his Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara. He confirmed that. So JFK was a man of peace, willing to sacrifice his life for that cause. And we revere him, people like you and me, to this day because of it. I think Bobby's the same. I think JFK, by the way, in 1960, ran against the Republican Richard Nixon, who was a Cold War hawk, as more pro-Cold War than he was, than Nixon was. He ran on the missile gap, which is bullshit, a lie. The Soviets had far fewer nuclear missiles than we did. There was no missile gap that favored the Soviet Union. So JFK was probably aware of that. He was told that shortly after he was elected by his science advisors. No, there was no missile gap. So the fact is, he ran in a way that we would not have approved of to this day. He ran on a lie. Like Bobby is wrong about Israel. But he's right, as I say in my column, on so many other issues. And let me go through some of those that he's talked about and promoted. He's right about the corporate takeover of Washington. All those agencies that are supposed to protect us, the FDA, the CDC, and so on, do not. They've been taken over by the industries, by the corporations, as Bobby has said, that are supposed to protect us. And again and again, they don't regulate those industries. In fact, they promote their interests. They're actually functionaries of those industries. Bobby has said that. Bobby was an environmental lawyer. He worked for many years against those polluters, against companies like Monsanto. He won a huge lawsuit against Monsanto because they distributed Roundup, which is a terrible weed killer that causes cancer in those who use it. And it caused cancer in a groundskeeper who later died of cancer. And he represented that person in court in San Francisco. So Bobby, again and again, has been on the right side of battles against corporate polluters. Bobby is right, even though I spoke recently to some 250 people, and they loved me in San Francisco 2 nights ago in the Mission until I spoke about Bobby. And there was a mixed reaction at best about it. And because they think he's a crazy anti-vaxxer, not because of his position on Israel. So is he crazy? No. He wisely has questioned the overuse of drugs by Big Pharma on this country. whether they're antidepressants, vaccines that we don't need, that our kids don't need, and they are pushed on us. They're pushed on us by industry that controls the CDC and the FDA and too much of the medical profession. So he was the first major public official who was willing to actually risk his own reputation with his family, with his following, with the public, because he stood up against Big Pharma. He said Big Pharma was often wrong. They promote drugs that are unhealthy, that actually make us sick. Bobby has also advanced the cause of public health. He said we spend the most on public health, but we're the sickest nation when it comes to it. We're sick with diabetes. We're sick with the population's overweight that is stressed out. This is the end of hypercapitalism. It has turned our bodies, our very bodies, into victimhood. And so Bobby again has stood up for health, public health, and the rights of people to control their own bodies against Big Pharma and the chemical industry and others who want to make profits by making us sicker, basically, or killing us. So Bobby, I think, is on the right side of many issues. On military-industrial complex, despite Israel, he has spoken out of the military. We've been forever at war in some place on the globe. All my life, I'm 72. All my life, we've either been supplying the guns or involved in these wars abroad. Martin Luther King said many years ago, back in 1967 or 8, that we're in danger as a nation of losing our soul because we spend more money on killing people than educating people. Well, we have lost our soul since they killed Martin Luther King Jr. Back in '68. Military has taken over the economy, the politics of this country. We're forever. And Biden says, God bless our soldiers. He gave money. He wants to give more money to Ukraine to kill more Ukrainians. And he says, don't worry, that money is really for the factory workers here in the U.S. He's right. The military-industrial complex has actually compromised everybody, even every aspect of the economy, even people who work in Kentucky, work in Illinois, work in the heartland. They make bullets and bombs for Ukraine. So I think, like Martin Luther King said, this is killing our soul as a nation. He's the only candidate who says what's real. Trump doesn't address these issues. Biden doesn't. They're captives of these forces, of these corporate forces. Yes, he's very wrong about Israel, and it breaks my heart. And I've communicated that to him, and I've talked to a number of people. I've posted about it. And yet, it's politics. Politics will break your heart. But he's the best by far of the three candidates. He inspires me. His courage inspires me. Biden won't even give the guy Secret Service protection. They killed his uncle. They killed his father. And he goes out there every day and risks his life. He has no Secret Service protection. He's forced to pay Gavin DeBecker for security. That comes out of the pocket of the campaign. That's ridiculous. That should be something that's paid for by the taxpayers. Even Hunter Biden, the ne'er-do-well son of the president, gets Secret Service protection. Nikki Haley, for God's sake, even though she polled much lower than Bobby, has gotten Secret Service protection. So to me, that's an outrage. So on issue after issue, Aaron, yes, Bobby's on the right side, the courageous side, I think, of the equation.
Yeah, it's the Israel business is obviously going to loom large, and he has a way of kind of praising right-wing libertarian or other. He goes on these little pro-capitalist little flights of fancy that I think are also very irritating, and yet it's so sad and pathetic that because America is really, we don't have a state religion, we don't have a state philosophy. We just sort of combine a national religion and a unifying philosophy in terms of making a buck. And it's really kind of it's so sad that this has been a country that's been that way, that we never really evolved. I mean, his own father would talk about how the things that the gross national product cannot measure and such. Bobby, I think it's a reflection of the times. You kind of have to. He's gotten away from that sort of rhetoric in many ways, and he has these peons to capitalism, which are, it's also it's a mess. This whole system is horrific, and how you even attempt to accommodate these forces in a coherent way and attain power, it may be impossible because it's a really evil system, which is why some people are just like, I'm just, how do you even speak to the unspeakable, evil of such a system of greed and exploitation and predatory, behavior constantly? You could just set yourself on fire, which we'll get to. So let's talk a little bit about some issues with the situation in Israel-Palestine, which has been, this ongoing horror. And most notably, spectacularly, we have Aaron Bushnell, a U.S. serviceman who self-immolated. And Chris Hedges has a good article on this, and there's an illustration here, a painting or drawing by Mr. Fish, cartoonist that often does these for Hedges articles. This is from his Substack. And the quote, I think, that is important: "Divine violence terrifies a corrupt and discredited ruling class. It exposes their depravity. It illustrates that not everyone is paralyzed by fear." Bobby Kennedy. "It is a siren call to battle radical evil. That is what Bushnell intended. His sacrifice speaks to our better selves." Now, I don't want to self-immolate. I have a family and so on. They would be sad. I don't know what to do against evil that you cannot confront. You can try to accommodate it because it is too powerful to overcome. I think that honestly, that's really Bobby's strategy, which is rational, but in a sense, but ultimately perhaps self-defeating in this case. Or you can go the other route, which is what Bushnell did. And I found it pretty amazing that we got to see some things that I hadn't really noticed. I didn't know that Obama actually praised the guy who self-immolated in Tunisia, which to me is like funny because I always thought like, that just seemed like a catalyst for a big U.S. color revolution that was to be a pretext for wars in Syria and Libya. And then now this tape emerges, or it was there all along, but people are showing Obama saying, "Oh, this guy, he ran his food cart or whatever it was some job like that, and then he self-immolated, and this is really inspiring, and this is going to inspire the region." Like, why is Obama doing that in a client state, right? But set that aside, a U.S. client state. Why is he cheering about the anti-regime activities of a guy in a U.S. client state? Because it was for bigger geopolitical goals that included also kneecapping some of Israel's enemies, even that. So that's remarkable. But set that aside, Bushnell and what he did here, this is pretty astounding. And I think it's the reaction to it from people who are pro-Israel is really telling. I don't know, Bryce, what have people said on campus about this issue? Because, are there signs or things, are people posting things in the physical space about this, like on bulletin boards or anything like that? Or what do people say about Bushnell?
There's only been I can only say what I have heard from fellow organizers in the the Solidarity Committee, but it's pretty unanimous that it was a great sacrifice, and that you can always argue about different tactics and whether or not this was effective in ending the war or whatnot. But it's one of those things, like organizing is, where you won't know the fruits of your labor until long after it happens. And the fact that people instinctively understand that this was, not a depraved act, not an act of mental illness, not an act of, irrationality, that it was, it's sort of a culmination of, how we're all feeling, is that there is no rational way to continue in this world without fighting to the utmost against this evil that we're seeing all the time. And he chose to fight in a way of making himself a spectacle to call attention to the worst aspects of our society. Most people here, we had, Sarah Lee Whitson talk here yesterday, and, she mentioned this protest, this act of extreme protest, as Bushnell called it. And, the audience was nodding. They understand that it like I just said, it speaks to our better selves. I'm not saying that I would like to do it. Like you said, I don't want to self-immolate because I genuinely think I have more to offer alive than dead. But that's not the case for every situation. And people respond to this madness in their own ways.
Yeah,
it's astounding.
I agree with Bryce. I agree with you that it was an act of great martyrdom. And we won't know, like John Brown, we didn't know before the Civil War, when John Brown took a stand and really precipitated, I think, the Civil War a few years later. We won't know what Bushnell's sacrifice will mean probably for some time. But I agree with you that it was a great act of courage. And his statement before he set himself on fire in front of the Israeli embassy was disturbing to me because it was so rational. He understood it was not the words of a crazy man. It was the words of a person who was deeply affected by the war in Gaza. And so it echoed with me. But I also think what happened in Michigan in the Democratic primary was also very important. And that took a lot of organizing, a lot that protest vote, uncommitted against Biden in battleground state in Michigan, very important state. And if Biden can't win that, or the Democrats, whoever replaces Biden, can't win it in November, they're lost. You know that. So that protest vote, what was it, north of 15%? I think between 15 and percent was all important. And I think slowly that movement is growing. There's a big protest out here in San Francisco that my sons and I are going to on Saturday, a pro-Gaza ceasefire. And that's going to be, I think, a big event as well. And there have been protests across the country, as you know, and Bryce probably helped organize some of them on the Indiana campus. So I think that the battle for sanity in the Middle East is on many fronts right now, but the sacrifice that Airman Bushnell endured in Washington was, I believe, very powerful and very disturbing.
Yeah, I as far as the Michigan protest vote goes, it'll be fascinating to see how that plays out because, I mean, the Democrats I think that as people have said, there should be a ceasefire before the election. If not, it's really insane. But the Democrats can't win with Biden, I don't believe. So they may replace him, and as I've said this before, but I think they may replace him with someone who basically says the generic U.S. line, like, oh yeah, we're going to work on a two-state solution. It's time to resume the peace process. The world has spoken, and it'll just be bullshit. But then that person will, because they're taking at least that position, and there's no ceasefire to call for anymore, that they could pick up a few votes. They could get some of what Biden has lost, and Israel will have been able to do the most that it could do anyway. So I fear that the Democrats may actually do that. And so whoever comes in and actually takes a more superficially reasonable response towards Israel may benefit from that. And I think there's a good chance that that'll be the Democrats, although it won't really mark a genuine change in policy. I don't believe. I believe it'll just be a rhetorical thing. Just as the U.S. support for the two-state solution for decades has been a totally rhetorical thing. But we will see how that plays out. Now, Bryce, you've written an article recently, it just came out on the 23rd, shielding U.S. public from Israeli reports of friendly fire on October 7th. We've talked about this issue before, and the article covers a number of really bad reporting, instances of bad reporting across the corporate media. And this one was the one that on this issue anyway that I thought was the most absurd. The one by Elizabeth Dwoskin in the Washington Post. And the article is summed up by you guys here in a caption. The Washington Post conflates random cranks who claim that the October 7 attack was staged by the Israeli military with independent journalists who report on Israeli media exposés of friendly fire deaths and associates both with Holocaust denial. So this is an old trick We've seen it again and again. If you talk about like JFK people, JFK critics of the Warren Commission, they'll say, "Oh, you think it was like the Illuminati, or you think it was the Jews? You think the driver shot Kennedy?" You know, you always have these ridiculous conspiracy theories to basically discredit one's any conspiracy theory that would explain an event, so that you don't even have to address the more sober theorists that point to evidence of a conspiracy. So this was pretty horrible. How did you even choose which articles to focus on here? Because most of the reporting has been so bad, but this one stood out, the Dwoskin one. But you really go over a number of articles. After having put all this together, how would you sum it up?
Well, basically, it's what you said. There has been a lot of reporting about what actually happened on 10/7. We don't have a full picture, but it's a lot clearer than the picture is in the United States. The Israeli press has, even under military censorship, has managed to, inform the public about how the narrative of 10/7 has been distorted, deliberately manipulated, and abused by the Israeli government to enact this campaign of genocide. And so this story in the Washington Post was really the one that set me off and got me into actually doing a deep dive on it. It grew out of a Twitter thread I did, just reading the article and looking at what it said and how it arrived at its conclusions. And then I was asked to expand that and include more stuff in it. But basically, the whole premise of this idea is to shield the public from looking at any of the reports that come out in the Israeli press, and especially looking at any of the outlets in the U.S. that have talked about those reports in the Israeli press. Not a lot of them have come out in the American press. You can see constant stories about Israeli foreknowledge, about the importance of the attacks on Israeli civilians during the day of October 7th. You can see all sorts of those things in the Israeli press, but they only get covered by alternative outlets, places like the Gray Zone, places like Mondo Weiss, places like the Electronic Intifada. And those are the only places where you can go in the American press to look at that. But the Washington Post decided to lump them in with a bunch of Holocaust deniers. And it was pretty ridiculous. And we talked about this with Asa a couple of weeks ago. The evidence that they used to make the case was essentially included like Reddit post, a random Reddit post,
Telegram channels.
A random Telegram channel with 3,000 people, and then they picked out a random woman at a protest who said that Israel killed its own civilians, which is true. It's an objective, true fact. But they looped them all together that said that this is part of a growing group of October 7th truthers who believe that the attacks were secretly staged by America, or that the Israelis secretly staged this and no one was actually kidnapped, and just all this nonsense that has nothing to do with the reporting from Electronic Intifada or Gray Zone or Mondo Weiss. But they deliberately muddied the waters. It's, DeHaven Smith talked a lot about the use of conspiracy theory meme in order to discredit certain alternative explanations for major events in history. And this article seems to be just a case study in that. They didn't hammer the term conspiracy theory as hard as they might have back in the past, but the implication was clear because they spent so many paragraphs interviewing people like Holocaust experts who say that, Holocaust denial is just it's just something that happens when major events happen, and there's just a natural crankery in all of humanity that tends to deny atrocities like this. In one example, they have one guy who says that it's indisputable that Hamas did something, but people are trying to chip away at that and change history. Well, of course, what he doesn't say is what that something is, and he doesn't seem to recognize that what that something is seems to be the crux of the issue. But it's just more in the line of dishonest reporting from our mainstream journalistic establishments.
Yeah, it seems pretty. If you stop and think about it, what would have Hamas have been planning? And they said it after the fact, which seems rational. They wanted to bust out of the concentration camp that they'd been imprisoned in and tormented in and massacred in periodically, and they wanted to destroy the military capabilities of their tormentors who imprisoned them there, and they wanted to bring hostages back to Gaza to have leverage over the Israeli government so that they would be able to change their horrific conditions. That's logical. That's what they say they did, and the evidence suggests that that is what they did by and large, and that if any organization made an order to kill Israeli civilians that night, who benefited from that? Who really would have done that? Who did do that? We know the Israelis did do that. We don't know that Hamas did that. We know the Israelis were ordered to kill Israeli civilians, essentially. The Hannibal Directive, or in all but name, was imposed on that night because they calculated that was preferable to allowing them a victory by absconding with many hostages. So this is a key part of what happened, and it's astounding that this is something that is knowable through the internet. Not the exact specifics of it. We don't know if other people were killed by some of the people that broke out of Gaza that night. Probably were accidentally, at least, and perhaps intentionally. But they've lied so much about everything, and the only systematic or authorized organizational slaughter of Israeli citizens seems to have been coming from the Israeli military, and they don't want to admit that. So they smear people, and with terrible logic, and we're not allowed to know that it happens. I mean, it has parallels with so many other issues in U.S. The way our system operates is to just deny and smear and so on, and they can do it for decades, like with the Kennedy assassination. So it's good that you all are out there, that people like you, Bryce, are taking the time, and Ace is reporting, we've had him on here, documenting this, because it's insidious, and I think the world is seeing through it now to an unprecedented extent, right as American power is collapsing. So this is a combustible situation. David, how much have you followed this story?
Well, I think this the issue that Bryce has raised here and you've raised about conspiracy thinking is crucial, and so I applaud you for looking into it. It's been thoroughly politicized, as you know, the term conspiracy thinking, conspiracy monger, and so on. It's meant to discredit anyone who has critical thinking about those in power. And of course, many so-called conspiracy theories are crackpot. Do I believe that there's a network of Democrats in a pizza parlor who meet in a basement pizza parlor to molest children and extend their control? No, I don't believe in that. That's a crackpot conspiracy theory. But I agree, Bryce and Aaron, that often legitimate conspiracy thinking is lumped in with crackpot thinking to discredit it. And they do it for a reason. Do you think power openly talks about what they want to do ever? No, they don't. As a student of politics and student power, I can tell you they talk among themselves quietly. Do you know what conspiracy means? Where it's from, the etymology of the word? It's from
to breathe, right?
Breathe or whisper together. Do you think they talk quietly among themselves before they enact policies? Before, like the Tonkin Gulf Resolution in Vietnam that it paved the way to the war in Vietnam, like the WMD bullshit theory, the weapons of mass destruction that led to the invasion of Iraq, numerous conspiracies we can cite. Yes, the JFK assassination is one of them. So that's what power does. They whisper together beforehand. They determine what a policy they would advance their interest is, and then they move on. Allen Dulles, the former head of the CIA, was a very powerful figure. And as I argue in my book, The Devil's Chessboard, he probably was the key figure who organized the assassination with his multiple connections to Wall Street, to the Texas oil industry, to the military, to the intelligence world. He was the Dick Cheney on steroids of his day. Yes, he probably organized it. Then he had a seat conveniently on the Warren Commission. And he probably ran that Warren investigation, such as it was, to whitewash Lee Harvey Oswald as the lone assassin. But he did so with money, with backing, as I say in my book, from others, from very powerful, very wealthy figures in the corporate sector who decided President Kennedy had to go. And I think, by the way, that research, who funded Dallas, is very important. So who benefited also from October 7th? That was Bryce's subject. And how are critics of the war in Gaza being portrayed in this country? And as crackpots, as lunatics, they're lumped together. Now, that said, as I said before this, I do believe that so-called some extreme thinking about October 7th bears further investigation. The Israeli intelligence community is known throughout the world for its intelligence, for its sophistication, for its surveillance. They have to surveil a very small, relatively small, and very close population, the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. Do you think they knew about October 7th in advance? Just like 9/11, we know that the Israeli government, who was warned repeatedly that Hamas was about to invade and cause serious, damage in Israel before October 7th. This country, I edited a book about 9/11 by two investigative journalists. It was called The Dogs Didn't Bark. That was taken from Sherlock Holmes. The dogs didn't bark for a reason before 9/11. The CIA, the FBI, they knew that there were plotters who were plotting 9/11, who were plotting damage to American institutions, and they didn't do anything, the Bush administration and so on. They didn't do anything for political reasons because it served their interests. I think October 7th should actually be further analyzed and researched as a deep event. Was it allowed to happen? I believe that, yes, Hamas invaded for legitimate reasons, for understandable reasons. The Palestinian people were about to be sold out in a historic pact between the Israeli government and Saudi Arabia. So I think that was one factor in their decision, Hamas's decision to invade. The Palestinians were about to be sold out by Israel and Saudi Arabia, and much of the world, I believe, would have gone along. So I think October 7th and the war that ensued, in some ways, not only saved the Netanyahu administration, but also saved the Palestinian cause as well. And Hamas knew that. So yes, I think October 7th should be analyzed further, but Bryce is on to something when he says that the media coverage in this country, what is going on in Israel and Palestine, is truly distorted and outrageous in many ways.
Yes, and it does bring to mind the issue of 9/11 as well, where you look at these missed warnings and such, and these other suspicious, activities between the intelligence services and Al-Qaeda going back historically. And then you look at how Israel has supported Hamas in the past, and you have this weird kind of taxonomy of pretextual events, wherein a false flag would be like if October 7th was a bunch of Israelis dressed up as Hamas and pretended to attack, Israel or attack Israel, and then to serve as a pretext. But then you have these other areas where it seems like they allowed it to happen and facilitated it perhaps in ways that we don't know, or used third parties to make sure that this or that group was funded because they were reliably, bent on doing what what the U.S. or the empire needed them to do. And it's really something. I do think that the logic of Hamas wanting to stop the normalization of relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia is made this a rational thing, as did the taking of hostages. But Israel's response has been so, if they were looking to exploit this to the hilt, they really have, but they've revealed too much of what their real agenda is, because it was clear to many people that they were doing everything to avoid the creation of a Palestinian state. And that really only had two real end games, which is some sort of horrible apartheid forever, or a final solution to the Palestinian question. And it looks as though they've gone the latter, but that's a decades-long thing by Netanyahu. I mean, it was Netanyahu's goons. You know, he gassed up the public and these settler fanatics, this whole movement in Israel, and that's what killed Rabin. So he's already revealed himself to be part of a murderous and messianic, zealous movement of lunatics, really. And now they've shown their true face, and I think more people are looking at like, well, wait, what have they been gearing towards all these years? And it relates to U.S. foreign policy as well, because now we've got these troops in Iraq and in Syria, and you're like, why were they there for that long? You know, and you go back and you look at Wolfowitz and other very Zionist neocons who've been a part of this strategy of just making sure that Israel and the U.S. were unassailable bullies in the Middle East. And it all seems to be this insane project that I think more people are waking up to. And I don't see that they're going to be able to just accuse everybody of being a conspiracy theorist if they don't believe the official lies anymore. I think that this is a watershed in this whole in all of these events, and it's happening as the U.S. is weaker, and we're seeing new formations in the rest of the world, the global South, the rest of humanity, really humanity collectively outside of this white power structure, which I think is really oligarchic. I don't think it's a skin color thing. I think whiteness is a kind of oligarchic brand and a psychological operation that they've put on us so that we're politically stupefied and we identify as white in our own country and then around the world. It's just this world order of, Chase Manhattan, Exxon, Raytheon running everything. And that's the whiteness that we're talking about in a sense. But I think that this is teetering, and they're coming together to use the international, court to handle this, to use the UN's criminal court to handle these serious issues in ways that we haven't seen before. So I feel that they did not reach the finish line with their goal for greater Israel and a new American century. Those two things were very intertwined, and what we're really seeing is the failure of these two insane totalitarian global quests, really failing at the same time. And what's gonna happen? This is what we're waiting to see. Bryce, your camera's out, but you're still there. Okay, I'll take him off of here for a moment. The last thing I wanted to talk about here is this massacre in around a food truck. And Al Jazeera reported first, or they reported on this, and then I'll talk about some blog commentary. But dozens killed by Israeli fire in Gaza while collecting food aid, more than 100 killed and 750 wounded. There's video of this, but I think it's mostly edited in different ways. It's strange. It just looks, I haven't seen a really definitive video where you can say what happened. And I think that's revealing. If they had a full video that didn't have a cut in it and so on, then you'd see more. So why are they editing it? We can guess why. But Moonover, Alabama points to something interesting about this, which is that the top part here in this passage I took from a blog post is actually from an AP article. And they were asked about these aid trucks that were sent in with some food. And the spokesman for the UN's Humanitarian Coordination Office, Eri Kaneko, said the UN was not involved. So Moon out of Alabama, a good blog on Ukraine and U.S. geopolitics in general, he says the trucks were sent by the Zionists flatly. Well, I can't say that that's true, but I think that's a reasonable inference. No other organization was involved, but when people came near to the trucks to collect the food, they had carried into Gaza, the Zionists went berserk. So it seems like this was an Israeli operation or authorized by Israel, and then the Israeli military just started killing these people. That appears to be what happens. They say it was a stampede, but if it was a stampede of starving people, I'd say Israel's still pretty guilty there, even with their cover story. But this is really astounding. The Israelis send aid trucks into people that they are starving, and then their military kills the people trying to get food. This is horrific. It's really Nazi level things that we are seeing regularly. There's another picture that's going around of a Israeli child run over by a tank. It's one of the most gruesome things I've ever seen. It's almost so gruesome that it's not gruesome because it doesn't even look like it could be real. Like you look at it, it looks like some AI generated thing. It's just the most horrific things that I can recall seeing, or as horrific as anything I've ever seen. This this is astounding. I don't know what else to say about this. Bryce, have you heard anything else about this food massacre that you should add here?
It's just another day. I mean, it's just another day, another massacre. You see, of course, the Israeli Hezbollah machine runs up to try and justify it, or to try and throw mud in the air so people can't get a full, easy grasp for what happened. But I mean, the idea that Israel fired on a bunch of people trying to get trucks. I mean, this wouldn't be the first time that happened. And if they blew up the truck, it wouldn't be the first time that happened. If they used a drone with a gun to shoot people trying to get aid, it wouldn't have been the first time that happened. And so I don't even think that this is, I mean, facts are important, but at least for me, this didn't seem to be one of those times where I need to jump into fact-checking action. It's just, it fits perfectly in line with what they do. And predictably, of course, the media say, people died in chaos. Okay, well, even if you accept that there was some sort of stampede, it's in the context of a deliberate Israeli campaign of starvation, which would lead to something like that. So again, the U.S. media is being exactly how the Israelis expect them to be, exactly how I expect them to be, and throwing, just muddying the waters. It's pretty despicable, and it's awful, and it's sad. And what more can you really say?
Well, I will say one. I agree with you, Bryce. I will add one thing. I think Israel at this point, and we're talking about this, is not speaking with one voice. I think Israel is a mess, and it knows it's a mess. The world opinion has turned against Israel. Thank God South Africa and the UN court have turned against Israel, calling it an apartheid nation, a society, pursuing apartheid policies in Palestine. So I think two things are happening. One, Netanyahu's political survival depends on his alliance with nuts, with religious extremists and nationalists. That's why he's in power. Those people, as Aaron said earlier, want to basically exterminate the Palestinian people, want to remove that problem by what we did with the American Indians, basically wiping them out. There are other more sane forces within Israeli society and power, thank God, who want to appease world opinion, who want to, I believe, pursue a different policy than what Netanyahu has in mind. Even Bobby Kennedy Jr. Thinks Netanyahu is part of the problem, which he is. But if Netanyahu were removed tomorrow, we know there are many, many others in Israeli power who are just like him or worse. So I believe that is also what's going on here. There's a factional dispute within Israel, and basically what they do day to day depends on not only on world opinion, but also on internal Israeli politics. And we should be aware of that. The second thing is what the U.S. is doing. And we talked about that earlier. It's our job as activists, as writers, to actually restrain the U.S. And what happened in Michigan, what happened with Airman Bushnell, what happened with the protests on the streets, like the one I'm going to on Saturday in San Francisco, very, very important because we're trying to restrain the U.S. as the major weapons supplier to Israel from pursuing that exterminationist, I think, policy.
I agree that's what everybody should do what they can to pressure the U.S., anything to confront politicians. I think the politicians, as they campaign, are going to have a difficult time going anywhere without being confronted with these things, although maybe the Trump crowd probably isn't obsessed with or preoccupied with this issue. But for the other candidates, I think that they probably should be forced to confront their support for these policies until it should become untenable. It should become untenable eventually for any politician to have anything to do with this murderous enterprise. And we are nowhere near that state yet, even though the rest of the world is, which by the way is really of the like liberal, check your privilege business that we talk about. What is more an example of like the privilege of the U.S. than to totally disregard the vast majority of the non-white world's opinions on this issue, which is the vast majority of humanity, and just to say no, we, this tiny minority who has the power, are correct, and we get to do whatever we want, and you are all wrong. Because we are superior to you. We are the deciders. We rule the world, and the world is sick of this, and for good reason. And hopefully, it is going to evaporate soon. This sort of the white supremacy, Western imperialism, whatever the world has been living under since Christopher Columbus, really, we could say. And I think that it's untenable, and people should realize it. And the sooner that the oligarchs realize it, the more that we can redirect ourselves, and it would be better for everybody, including them. Any last words here, Bryce, before we close?
No, I just, you're right. You're right about the state of America, and it's also important for people here to, keep their heads on straight, to make sure that they have the, the clarity to act when necessary. These politicians are going to be coming around. I know they're going to be coming around Indiana sometime, and we have motivated people who are willing to make it, not make it easy for them to live in peace. So I think that everyone has to do their part and take the opportunities that they have.
And bear witness to things. If you do not have the ability to prevent it, then at least bear witness to great evil and suffering in the world. And note what Aaron Bushnell did as a sort of cry for a cry out to something. It is like a divine kind of hatred. It's an appeal to authority of a higher kind, and a statement of outrage over not being able to do anything about such evil in the world. And in a sense, he speaks for us all, so we don't have to. And for that, he should be praised. And so we salute him for that. One other thing I wanted to talk about in the vein of conspiracies is this new Netflix miniseries, which is 4 episodes long. It's called American Conspiracy: The Octopus Murders. And when I saw that this was coming out, I was surprised, and I was wondering how they would handle it on Netflix. But they did put Wormwood on there, which was by Errol Morris, who's sometimes is a liberal and doesn't do the best stuff, especially on things like JFK. But he did the Wormwood series, which is good, and he's doing something on Chaos by Tom O'Neill, which should be really amazing, on Manson and Bugliosi and all that. So now Netflix has American Conspiracy: The Octopus Murders, which tells the story of Danny Casolaro as he tries to investigate what he calls the octopus. We might call it the Enterprise. We might call it the Umbrella, whatever you would call the sort of clandestine networks that were in high, they were very powerful under Ronald Reagan, especially, but they go back and they go forward. It's just the U.S. part of the U.S. deep state, and so they cover this, and we're going to do more on this show. But David, I thought you might appreciate this, because the guys that made this movie, they did interviews on TrueAnon, our friends over at TrueAnon, and they were asked about some of the bigger picture things, what it really represents. And this was I was excited. I was like curious to hear this, because a lot of it was kind of personal, which I was honestly less interested in as a scholar of this stuff, really. But the filmmakers said that one of them pointed out that, like, well, what Danny was saying about the octopus wasn't, this is all of these figures, and he didn't necessarily have all the goods on all of them, and he was straining to like try to tell this story. And like, when I think of, what is the deep state, he says something to the effect of, when I think of what the deep state, I think of like what David Talbot describes in Devil's Chessboard. So they mention Alan Dulles in your work on Alan Dulles, and how it goes back and how it's really the top of Wall Street. So to me, it was like, okay, well, these guys actually do seem to have a good grasp on it. And they didn't convey that much in the Netflix series, but maybe that would have resulted in it not being made. But so do you plan to watch this, David, or are you or have you heard much about it, or what do you think of this?
I have not, Aaron, heard anything about it, and I will indeed watch it. I get Netflix, obviously, so I will watch with great interest. I think it's mostly on the right wing, frankly, and the libertarian rather than the liberal wing of things, unfortunately, as because that's where I was comfortable, the progressive wing. But I think this conspiracy thinking about how power really functions is really taken root in the right-wing culture. And I think that's probably to the good, because I do think the kind of curiosity about how power really functions is important for us to all understand as American citizens. And I think the right, for whatever reasons, have more curiosity, frankly, than the left. The left has kind of gone along with Obama, kind of gone along with Biden, has been, I think, lulled to sleep about how Wall Street, the military, Washington, the oil industry, how it really functions, big pharma. Yes, it's
That's
time
liberals,
that the
though,
left,
mostly, David. David, that's mostly liberals. Well, set big
yes,
pharma aside. It's the left. It's just the left is so small that you may as well just talk about the liberals, because the left is almost, a
that's true. But
non-entity.
there is, I think there's yes, I think there is a liberal culture, a so-called liberal culture, and it's around the New York Times, around the Washington Post, around much of media that we know. I think they're the conventional liberal voice and the establishment liberal voice. They're the voice of the establishment Democratic Party, the DNC, and so forth. And that's an important voice still in this country. And they poo-poo anything about power, any investigation into that, because they're part of that world. And so they suppress any kind of, I think, curiosity the public has. As we were talking about on the show earlier, they conflate one conspiracy thinking as legitimate. I think any conspiracy thinking that is legitimate with the kind of kooky stuff, and they can dismiss everything. So I will watch the show. Some of the conspiracy thinking, as you and I know, is kooky, and some is right on.
Right. There are bad conspiracy theories, and there are bad no conspiracy theories. I think that the Lee Oswald shot Kennedy and created 7 wounds with 1 bullet. I think that that's a very implausible conspiracy theory. So it's good that they're doing more things like this series. And Peter Del Scott wants to watch this also.
You're right, Aaron. You're right, Aaron. Power does also engage in kooky conspiracy theories because they cover shit up all the time.
Like Russia's always conspiring.
Yeah.
Thanks to Dana Chavarria for producing this episode, and thank you for tuning in. Visit 4diedtrying.com and buy the prologue, now on Amazon. Keep your eye out for Chapter 1, which is also available, and you can get it on Patreon if you subscribe there. Please do subscribe to the American Exception podcast on Patreon for first access to all Devil's Chess Club episodes and for all new and past episodes of the American Exception podcast, including the Peter Del Scott Oral History series. I'd like to close by saluting Aaron Bushnell. I'd like to close by saluting Aaron Bushnell. I do not hope to see others follow in his exact footsteps, but with his life and death, he honored humanity and the human spirit. Maybe a post-Zionist, post-U.S. Empire world will be as if someone poured gasoline on the devil's chessboard and lit a match.